one of a talk that I'm going to do 3 parts of. Let me see. Okay. Just make sure we can advance here. So this one's called Get Inspired. The first is part 1. We're going to talk about design. The second part is going to be planting and installation, and that's going to be May 8th. The third part is going to be maintenance, and that will be July 24th. So what I'm aiming for in general is a whole systems approach where we keep nutrients on site and we keep water on site and we try to keep things that are on site there and use them again and again. So I'm going to go fairly quickly because there's a lot of things I want to share tonight, and this will be recorded. So if you miss something, it's there. It's also, most of the pertinent things are on the handout too, so you don't have to take super fast notes. So first of all, I want to talk about design basics. I'm going to talk about making a base map and doing a site analysis, defining your goals, creating your first plan, which is your conceptual design plan, and then how you select plants to sort of populate that plan with the plants. Then I'm going to share some project examples after that, and then our future talks, of course, will be installation and maintenance. So first of all, to make a base map, you're going to go outside and measure the area you want to do the design for. I actually use like either a 25-foot tape or a 100-foot measuring tape and just literally go out and measure it. And then I'm also going to think about where are my windows and my views, where are my utilities, like my water and my sewer, where does my electrical line run? Then I'm going to take that and draw it on a sheet of paper. Usually it's like an 11 by 17 or 8.5 by 11. And I'll draw it to either a 1/4 inch equals a foot or an 1/8 inch equals a foot. And on the right there is a scale. You can actually use a scale which will help you convert your feet to a smaller size. So that's what I do to begin, get that on a piece of paper. And after I kind of give you this overview, I'll show you a demonstration of each of those pieces of what I did for one project. So when I'm doing my site analysis, I'm going to think about, am I in the sun? Am I in the shade? What are my microclimates? Like, do I have a big tall tree that creates some shade? Or does my house cast some shade? And look at soil compaction. Sometimes if you've done a house remodel, or even if you've just had things in the yard for years, the soil gets really compacted. And then we need to do some good rehabilitation to make sure that it can be fruitful for plants. Of course, we talked about utilities, mature trees also, because those pose challenges for roots and oxygen and air and water. Do you have a strong wind pattern? Like sometimes we get a lot of wind coming off the bay this way, but if our house faces to the south, we don't get as much wind in that yard. And then views, like, do I want to block any views? Do I want to enhance any views? What do I want to see out my window? What do I want to see when I look at my house? That kind of thing. Then I'm going to define my goals. So I break those down into 3 different categories. They're functional, aesthetic, and ecological. And I'll talk about each one of those 3 in a little bit more detail with a slide for each one. And as I'm going through my goals, I'll start writing down a wish list. So what are all the different pieces of the things I want that relate to those goals? So first of all, functional goals. Functional goals are all about what the function of the space is and how you use the space. So for example, do you want to have a sitting area? Do you want to have a pathway connecting to your house if it's a front yard? Utilitarian elements like tools, where are you going to store those? Where might you store your trash or your recycle bins? And also just anything that you want to do to use the space. So it's mostly functioning for people, but we're also starting to think ahead to how it might function for non-people like wildlife as well. And then now, of course, even more than ever, we're thinking about fire resilience. That's a function of the landscape as well. Maybe we want to put that tree a little farther from the house than we used to, or we're going to bring shrubs a little farther to respect the zone 0 clearance, which is basically keeping embers away from the house. And that could be a whole talk in itself, but it's something to think about with function. Aesthetic goals are all about what things look like. So we want to think a lot about function and habitat, but when we're designing a garden, we're still really thinking about how it looks, because a lot of us want to have good curb appeal. We want the garden to look like a designed space. And so aesthetic goals are a lot about your personal taste. Maybe you love blue, maybe you love gray foliage, things like that. Um, Thinking about having a focal point. So rather than having a whole jumble of lots of different plants, maybe there's certain things that draw your eye, and then other areas that are calmer swaths of massing of plants. So those are all aesthetic goals. I also strongly consider things that are like very basic to my landscape architectural training, like texture, contrast, and form. And I'll show some example pictures later, but texture is having like a fine textured grassy plant next to something with bigger leaves, and just having differences in those textures, and kind of sometimes a garden will have similar textures repeated, and other times it'll have very different textures, and that can be kind of personal preference too. Some of us like things that are really busy, and others of us like things that are very calm and simple. So repetition, not just doing one of every single thing like a botanic garden, but having some repeated plants. And then thinking a lot like about foliage, bark, and berries, and all sorts of different aspects of plants to give the design sort of more depth. Because if we only think about flower colors, maybe it's going to look fantastic during the whole year if we really plan it out. But we know that there's times of the year where the native plants aren't all going to be in bloom. Spring, easy, right? But late summer, harder. So we might think about, oh, we're going to have something that has a beautiful bark during that year, or a really beautiful green foliage. So that gives the garden structure so that it looks good all the time. And then having attractive hardscape elements too. Just, a simple thing like a fence or an accent rock or a nice path can give the garden a sense of design and definition. And I think I already talked about seasonal change, but just in case, seasonal change, having things that happen throughout the year. So the ecological elements of design are all about how we relate to nature. So we think about our function, our aesthetics, and one of the reasons we're all here is an ecological interest for sure. So hydrozoning, I'll talk a little bit more about that in an instant, which is basically grouping plants according to water needs. California native, of course, by community, and we'll talk more about that today as well. Spacing plants appropriately, having an efficient watering system, keeping our rainwater on site, and using top dressing and mulch, and then reducing our waste and maintenance. So I'll talk a little bit more about all these things tonight. So hydrozoning is basically grouping plants according to watering needs. And if we start at the beginning thinking about hydrozoning, it makes everything a whole lot easier. Because if we start putting plants with different watering needs right next to each other, we've already made life a lot more difficult. Unless we're going to go around and hose water and pay attention to each one separately, it's going to be a lot easier to group them. Obviously, sun-loving plants are going to be happier in the sun, shade plants in the shade. So if we research from the beginning where plants kind of want to be and then group them together, it makes things a lot more simple. And then to take that further, I'll talk about designing by plant community, which makes things really fall into place even. So here's just a quick example of like a very typical property and how you might start thinking about hydrozoning on a yard like this. So you might have areas of mixed sun plantings separated by irrigation from the tree, which is irrigated separately. You might have an area of vegetable garden, you put that on a separate watering system, and then some areas that are shade. So each of these color-coded areas might potentially be a separate irrigation zone if you're watering with irrigation, or if you're hand watering, at least they're kind of grouped together. So that's a hydrozoning example. Plant spacing. These are different things to plan ahead. So plant spacing is a big deal. I am guilty of this for sure. I want to pack a whole bunch of stuff in my yard. I put way too much in there, and then I realize I've got to prune, and I realize things have grown on top of each other. And part of the thing that happens here is when you get that plant and it's super tiny, it's impossible to imagine it's really going to get 8 feet, but they really do. And a lot of times when you research what the plant size will be in a garden setting, they'll actually get bigger than that. So it's important to think at the beginning, do you want your garden to be really wild, or do you want to actually have spaces in between? And if you want space between, look at the diameter of the plant and then give at least another couple feet around it to make sure you can navigate through that area. So crowded plants basically are not as good because the more you have to prune, the more it's not going to reach its full shape, the more it's not going to reach its full flowering potential, and it's just a lot more yard waste that you're generating that then you have to figure out how to compost or to do with it. So it's less healthy as well for the plant because it's constantly being pruned. Now, sometimes you might consciously decide to put things a little closer because you're trying to create a certain aesthetic, and it's just nice to know whether you're consciously doing it or whether it's accidental. Like I said, I've done it accidentally many times. I've put too many plants in one space. So when you're drawing your design plan, when you put the circles on your plan view drawing, look up, oh, okay, it gets to 8 feet, make your circle 8 feet. So when it first goes in, it'll be a tiny little thing with lots of mulch around it, and then later it will grow to the size. The other thing is how to arrange plants on the plant. So if you want a more natural look, you typically might group things according to odd numbers. So like one plant as a focal point, or a cluster of 3, or a cluster of 5. Sometimes I'll do a cluster of 3 or 5 and then another one kind of off to the side to give it a little bit more of a haphazard feeling, but it's still kind of planned. And then a more formal look would be a little bit more linear, usually fewer plants, usually more architectural evergreen type plants. So that's kind of goes along with whatever style you pick is how you group things. And the whole second and third parts of this are going to be all about irrigation and maintenance. However, it's important to think about these things before you do your design and as you're doing your design, thinking about like what is your water budget? How often would you ideally water? Most native plants, if you say I'm going to water once a week, once every 2 weeks, easily achievable with especially the chaparral and oak woodland plants. There are also plants that can take no summer water once established. And then there are plants that come from a little bit more wet zones of California that need more water. So thinking about what your personal goals are and achieving that with your design. And then second of all, thinking about how much do you actually like gardening? Are you going to hire somebody to do maintenance? It's really important because you can actually have a pretty high maintenance native garden. It's easy to do, but there are plants that don't need a lot of pruning. And these two in the pictures are two good examples. In the front is a manzanita, and in the back is a ceanothus. And neither one of those needs any flower deadheading or anything. They, in fact, need very little pruning over their whole entire lives. They just need a little bit of shaping, and sometimes that's every few years or even less. So these are two really good examples of things. If you want to go super low water and very low maintenance, you pick plants that don't need a lot of little deadheading of flowers. Planning ahead also for healthy soil as well. Now, this could also be an entire talk on its own. The main point here is to have some soil cover because in nature, the leaves fall down from the trees, they stay on the ground, and the tree is very happy with that because it protects the soil. It keeps the soil a little bit, dampened from the summer heat. It kind of keeps it a little cooler. It helps prevent weeds to some extent. So in the garden, we replicate this by using wood chips, and we often put cardboard underneath the wood chips as sheet mulching. So just taking our cues there with that natural approach, rather than cleaning up every single leaf, recognizing that leaves that fall on the ground are actually contributing to the health of the soil. And that decomposition of the leaves and the berries and the flowers is actually adding nutrients to the soil. It's feeding the millions of microorganisms that exist in the soil. And that healthy soil is what makes a healthy plant. So it's not about just like adding fertilizer, it's about building healthy soil over time. So keeping water on site, here's one quick idea, is letting your downspouts flow into a lower area of your site, and that is called a rainwater garden. And there's actually a rebate for creating rainwater gardens, which is, you can put plants in them like this one, you can just have it be mulched. This is a great spot for those plants that like to be a little bit wet in the winter. Some of the grasses and a fair amount of our riparian plants do really well in these types of rainwater gardens. And a great way to just keep your water from flowing out to the street And the plant roots actually filter out toxins, and then the water goes down, stays in the soil, and helps the soil be more of a sponge, which contributes to more water resilience during the worm season. One thing quickly to note about rainwater gardens. Will it let me go back? Yeah. Okay, so if you do a rainwater garden, generally suggested keep it 10 feet or more from the foundation of your house. Just one quick note. The other thing is keeping soil on site and building mounds with the soil or berms. Now, this is great because a lot of our plants that come from the chaparral communities like to have good drainage. And some of our gardens don't naturally have that great a drainage. So if we're going to put a path in or make a rainwater garden or any other kind of excavation where we have extra soil, we will use it on the site to create some kinds of mounds and then plant on them. And it can be a nice big area like this, or it can even just be mounding up around each little plant a little bit as you plant to make sure that it's not planted too low. So back to the design process. So when I get ready to, I've done my base plan, I've done my site analysis, I've done a lot of pre-thinking about my function, my aesthetics, my ecology, and those different topics that we've discussed. I'll start to sketch my rough ideas on that base plan, and I'll usually take a sheet of tracing paper and just kind of start sketching out my ideas. And a lot of times I'll take some photos that I might have found in a book or on the internet or just lists of plants and kind of have those all around me to kind of direct my thinking as I'm creating my plan. It's not important to be like perfectly right the first time. It's more important just to kind of start thinking about ideas and put them on paper, either writing things down or sketching them down. When I'm thinking about that, I'm trying to be consistent with the style. So if I'm designing a house that I know is going to be like a Spanish style, I'm going to think about, does this plant represent the Spanish style? And kind of keep that in the back of my mind so that I keep some focus. Sometimes it's almost easier to design with some parameters, like some things that you know you're not going to do. It's hard when you have no guidelines whatsoever, but if you know, oh, I like blue and white flowers, I don't want red, I'm going to do a Mediterranean garden, it kind of helps focus you on a more limited set of parameters, which makes it easier. I start with the main elements first, so if I'm going to put a tree in, I'll figure out where's the tree going to go, where's the screening going to go, where's my path going to go, kind of the bigger things first, knowing that there's going to be space for the smaller little plants later. And then I also try to keep it simple. So I try not to do too much in a space. So here's my base plan. This is my example home. I'll show you a picture of this house as well. This has a very straight path, 2 patches of lawn, and a little bit of planting up near the house. It's about as plain as you can possibly get, and it's really ripe for inspiration. We know we can do better than this. So easy place to start from. So the site analysis for this house was, we had a hot south facing front yard. So we know we're going to need plants that can take the sun. We know we want to screen some views of the neighbor's property in this case. We have a soil that luckily drains decently well. This house is in Campbell, and the soil is clay loam. So that means we have some clay, but we also have some sand and silt, and we're going to get some water into it. We have no existing plants because we don't want that lawn, and we don't want those little shrubs by the house. And we also have Bermuda grass, which is a super fun challenge. Bermuda grass comes from roots under the ground and continues to come up and come up and come up. And it's going to take some challenges to remove that one. And with Bermuda grass, usually what I'll do is I will remove it and let it come back during the worm season and then continue to remove until I've got it out before I plant. However, I'll tell you what actually happened. This is actually my house, and this was 20 plus years ago. I didn't know as much about Bermuda as I do now. I rototilled it, which was bad. Rototilling, I'm so sorry I even told you I did that. Makes me But that destroyed my soil structure. It destroyed the little Bermuda grasses in a million little pieces, and then I had them coming up everywhere. However, mistakes can be made. You don't have to be perfect. I'm living proof of that. I have definitely won the battle against the Bermuda grass. So, and it didn't take 20 years either, thankfully. But don't do what I did. Learn from my mistakes. Let it germinate. Sod, cut it out, remove it, and continue to do that because that way, when you plant, you won't be battling it as much as I did. The utilities are all kind of along one side in this particular property. So here's the way the house looked before anything happened. You can see the straight path, the 2 patches of lawn. And sadly for me as a design professional, the straight path doesn't even line up with the front door. So I wrestled with that one for a long time. This was done on a fairly low budget because I didn't have that much money at the time. And replacing that path was actually quite a sticker shock, and it was not an easy thing to have to stomach, but it was worth it. So that I'll show you what we ended up doing with that. So I wanted to have a wider, or at least aligned front path. I wrestled with the idea of just adding something to the side of it, but since it wasn't centered, I knew it would really bother me forever. We needed a connection to the driveway because right now people walked across the lawn, but since the lawn was gone, I didn't want to walk across mulch every day. I wanted to have a focal point. I wanted to have an edge for all the people walking their dogs, so the dogs just didn't run into my yard. I wanted to have some seasonal interest, of course, wildlife habitat, of course. And then the style I settled on was a cottage style. So I wanted something that looked a little bit profuse and a little bit like an English cottage, but not too crazy. So this is the concept plan that was developed after the base plan, taking the sheet of tracing paper and then drawing on some ideas. So you can see the path ends up having a little bit of shape. It's not perfectly aligned. It has a little bit of a curve. That straight line behind the sidewalk is a little fence, with the idea being there that it might keep dogs from running in and just give some sort of like a hardscape structure without being overly defined. So it doesn't fence the whole yard in, it just gives an edge. And then a shade tree, a sitting spot, some tall shrubs, and then I just kind of label the other areas low plants. So I'm not thinking about every single plant yet. I'm just thinking about the overall concept or structure and the needs that I have for that space. And of course, in the back of my mind, I'm starting to maybe think, what could that shade tree be? Or what colors do I like? And sort of putting that together. But I'm sort of taking it step by step. And then this is the planting plan that we finalized for that space. And without going into all the different plans for this particular design, you can get an inkling that there is some repetition. You can see the green circles with the BP, they kind of repeat and cross the path. You can see the circles that are kind of yellowish with the MR. They've got some like zigzaggies and they're sort of a textural plant. They're actually a grass. You can see the trees on there. And you can kind of just get a sense for there's some different colors. If I were to get really into this, I could do like 4 different ones for different seasons and show what different things are blooming. And you don't need to do a fancy drawing like this on the computer. You can do circles and color pencil. I did that for years and it's really kind of fun actually to get out the actual drawing materials. And then I'll show you some before and after pictures. So this is what it looked like when we took out the Bermuda grass. And then that's 1 year afterward. Now the first year, things don't look that big because they went in really small. And we used poppies to fill the gaps. So a lot of times if you're a little impatient and you don't want to have a yard that looks like little plant, mulch, little plant, you can put some wildflowers in between, which is fantastic for habitat, really helps build good soil, and it looks really pretty. I find most neighbors walk by and say, oh, that's really neat. Like it just gives a good aesthetic. People like it. And then this is just this different angle, same garden, about the same age, before and after. Unfortunately, you can't really see the path very well, but you can kind of see the new plantings coming in. And that's a view from actually the roof looking down. You can kind of see the paths. We did paving stones so the water can kind of go in between the stones. And then you can see some of the purple, verbena, lilacina. I'll show a picture of that later. And the poppies. And then we use wood chip mulch for all the planting areas. And then this is a couple more years down the road. You can see the tree is starting to get a little bit bigger and take shape. That's an elderberry tree. And then some of the texture of the grasses is starting to come up in there. And then this is just an example of same exact view, but just different seasons of the year. So between May and July, you can see different plants blooming. The yellow is a sulfur buckwheat. That's in full bloom in May. And then as it sort of starts to fade, you get this sort of tending toward brown. Toward the end of the summer, it'll actually be like a russet brown color all over. But then the California fuchsia starts blooming in red. So you kind of get these different pieces of interest throughout the year. And then you also see different foliage colors, the gray next to the green, which is interesting as well. And the grape is actually an edible grape. So I like to mix edible plants in with my native plants, and I have citrus and grapes in my front yard. So next we're going to talk a little bit about plant selection in more detail. The first thing I want to talk about is why we want to plant natives in the first place. So the main reasons I plant natives are to reduce water and maintenance. And even when we do have maintenance, it can be done a little more on a very flexible schedule. So a native plant that needs to be pruned probably doesn't really matter too much if you do it now or 2 to 3 weeks from now. There's a big time frame. It's not like a lawn where if you let it go for a month, it's going to be really bad and it's going to look bad when you cut it. Most natives have a lot of flexibility in when you prune them. You can, if you want to go out and deadhead, you can do that, or you can wait till things bloom, shear back, and most plants will be pretty happy with that. They're also a chance to eliminate pesticides because native plants really combine very well with no pesticide use. And we actually don't want to put pesticides down because we want to encourage butterflies and caterpillars to use our plants. They're much more interesting. A lot of people don't realize what native plants are and they seem very exotic, but they're very interesting for that reason. And I also find it super interesting when I go hiking and see something and then I grow it in the garden, seeing how it behaves differently in the garden or the same, how it might bloom slightly differently. It's just, to me, it's just the whole thing is fascinating. And watching a plant, seeing something come to it, wondering what it is, discovering, oh, that's a small native bee. I didn't know such a thing existed. It's just fascinating for me having converted 2 homes from lawn to natives and seeing what came, what there was nothing there visiting it was lawn, and then lots of different things visiting it when it became native plants. So we have a good ecological link to habitat, and more we really need that because not getting that enough. We don't have enough wildlands available. Our homes are kind of becoming that nature place. So plants are also naturally adapted to our area. It allows us to connect more, and it just allows us to work with the seasons instead of against them. When I design for wildlife, I think most of food, water, and cover. So food is food that comes from plants or from the landscape itself. It's not feeders, it's the berries, it's the flowers, all the different aspects of the plant. And I've successfully have a year-round hummingbird habitat because I've got manzanitas and different salvias and plants blooming all year to attract hummingbirds, which is really enjoyable. And we create edges. By that, what I mean is different types of habitats, like a tree to a grassland or a shrub to a perennial. Those edges between different types of plant communities are very rich for wildlife. They like to have a tall thing to perch on and then be able to go down and forage among the wildflowers or grasses. So those are the edges between plant communities. They're actually called ecotones. We also want to accept some plant damage. So when we see something has eaten a plant, it's probably, hopefully a good thing, but at least to assume it's not a bad thing. It could be actually be a beneficial caterpillar eating our foliage, which is great. And then of course now locally native plants with things like Calscape, the website where you can go on, put your zip code in and actually find out what plants will benefit you in your zip code because they're locally native to you. And that website's on the handout. I'll also share it on the slides. But it's wonderful because you can sort by trees, shrubs, perennials, wildflowers. I have had a few clients who wanted to do gardens with plants from their zip code, within a mile or two from their zip code, which is wonderful. Calscape.org. Thank you. There it is. Thanks for the transition. So calscape.org is great because it will also tell you about pollinators. You can click on it and it will say which butterflies have been researched to go to a particular plant, which is super fun. It'll have customized plant search options that you can get into and search for different parameters for your yard. And the other one that's kind of interesting is helpabee.org, which is out of Berkeley. And it also shares information about bees, native bees, of which there are so many different types. And we have CNPS talks all about all the different native bees, most of which are not out to sting you and are just there to try to pollinate. And there are lists on that website of different plants and which bees like to go to those plants. So designing by community, I touched a little bit on this before, but now I'm going to go more into depth about this. This is the idea that as we're thinking about our hydrozones and our water areas and our sun and our shade, we're mapping that to plant communities. So we're thinking about our home as a natural space. Like if our home was in nature, what plant communities would exist in this space? And I'll talk about 3 of them tonight. I'm going to talk about chaparral, grassland, and I kind of lumped woodland into one category because those are kind of the 3 main ones. So plants evolve naturally in each of these communities to kind of have similar needs. They're used to growing together. It's beneficial for them to grow together. And if we plant them together in the garden, it makes things work a lot better. The first one I'll talk about is the chaparral or coastal scrub community. This is kind of a combination of 2 slightly similar plant communities in our area. Good examples of this and all of the communities can be found on most of the hikes up in our foothills areas, many of which CNPS offers, that are led by docents and volunteers who will talk to you about the plants in those communities. And I also have a talk that was recorded on YouTube, which is called From Trails to Gardens, which examines what we see when we're hiking and then what it looks like in a garden and goes through different plants. So chaparral is basically the garden you would do when you got that hot south side house, full sun, naturally no summer rainfall, adapted to very dry soils in the summer. These soils are typically well drained. That's why we're going to need to do a little bit of adjustment in our own gardens by raising up soils with berms to make sure those plants aren't sitting down in the clay, just getting rotted. They're usually sloped in nature. So another reason why we're going to try to replicate a little bit of slope. And there's usually very few trees, although you can have a chaparral garden and decide you want to put a tree in it. Then you're kind of bridging 2 plant communities in a space, which is perfectly fine. So these are going to be different examples of plants and landscapes from the chaparral community. This was a home I lived in for about 6 years in South San Jose, and this was the first garden I converted from lawn to natives. And we used poppies, of course, in that yard. We used Salvia Bee's Bliss, which is the low one with the purple flowers there, blooming very profusely right about now. And then Salvia spathacea, which is the hummingbird sage. And Salvia brandigii is the one with the white flowers kind of in the front there. So lots of low plants, lots of salvias. This got beating hot sun. It was South San Jose, super clay soil, and we built it up a little bit. And we actually put a little pea gravel path just to kind of represent a trail. So some of the plants in this community, this is actually a Southern California native, but it does very well in our area. It's called Salvia clevelandii, the Cleveland sage. What I love about this plant is it gets to be about 5 feet tall if you let it bloom out, and about 5 feet wide. And it's just a magnet for all sorts of things. Like you'll see little birds just perching in it, all around in it. And then hummingbirds, bees, some of the big native bumblebees as well, like this plant. It's a very fragrant plant, so if you're sensitive to the smell of sage, which I have found out that I am, maybe think about wearing face covering or gloves when you trim it. It's strong scented, but just an amazing pollinator plant. Blooms in the spring to late spring and really profuse blooms. This is manzanita. This is one of the plants that I use as a mainstay as much as possible because it looks good all the time. It is evergreen. It blooms in the winter to late winter. So a lot of them are just kind of finishing bloom right now. This plant will attract hummingbirds almost all winter long, which is very enjoyable to watch and just nice to support. The flowers are either white to pink to dark pink. There are varieties from tree all the way to middle shrub, all the way to ground cover. And I'll show a ground cover later on today. And you can trim up the bark and see the bark in time, so it makes a great focal point, or leave it as kind of a shrub. So all different sizes, very easy on maintenance. The one in the right-hand side, I think I've trimmed twice in about 15 years. So that is super easy care. And I don't water. Probably after the second summer, no summer water for the tree ones. This is redbud, Cercis occidentalis. This is the western redbud. This plant is going to be blooming right about now in peak. It's a great plant for birds. It's a wonderful plant for focal point. Great substitute for Japanese maple in a small garden, especially in the sun. Has little heart-shaped leaves that are just really attractive and kind of delicate. And then it loses its leaves in the winter and it turns kind of a yellowish, pretty color when it loses its leaves. This is hollyleaf cherry. This one you can see locally walking up the Jones Trail in Los Gatos and many of our other trails. It's an evergreen plant. It makes a great screening plant. So if you have a neighbor with a big house and you want to block them out, this is a great one. I've used that in my own backyard for this exact purpose. And it's makes a white flower in kind of the late spring to summer, and then it makes berries. So it's great because it has multiple seasonal appeals, and then it stays green all year. It will throw some fruits to the ground to make little sprouts. So it's good to know about this to keep up with pulling the sprouts out so they don't become a thicket of hollyleaf cherry, unless that's what you desire, in which case leave them to be. But a great screen plant and a good substitute for a lot of the more common evergreen plants that you'll see. What's interesting about this too is when you prune it, it smells like cherries. It's just a beautiful fragrance. The cherry is edible, but has a very big pit. So it's not going to be a super meaty, tasty cherry. Yeah, but it's not poisonous. Yeah, tasty, Vivian. This one is Baccharis Twin Peaks 2. That's the green sort of flowy ground cover. And this is also a good example of massing on a slope. So here we used a lot of the Baccharis and then a few of the California buckwheats as well, and then some salvia. This one is a pioneer plant. It's a little bit more of a coastal plant, so it's more of a coastal scrub plant. It grows very fast, and it will in time billow up pretty high, but it's nice because it fills the whole space. It's actually a great lizard habitat, as well as all sorts of different pollinators when it blooms. And then this is a buckwheat, California buckwheat, which is one of the top keystone plants. I probably should have covered more of them, but manzanita are one, oaks are one, buckwheats are one. The keystone plants are some of the plants that attract the most pollinators and support the most wildlife. And I think the oak tree is our primary one, but there's a lot of shrub keystone species as well. The buckwheats are great for native bees. They're great for butterflies as well. Oops. And this is also an interesting plant because it blooms in the summer to late summer through fall when a lot of things aren't as much blooming. So this is a great flower color for that time of year. And then the bottom left shows what it looks like when it's totally finished blooming. It turns kind of a rusty bronze color. This is a mixed garden in the spring. This one is in San Jose and shows lots of different flowering plants off because it's spring. The Verbena lilacina is the big purple one in the middle. The mimulus or monkey flower is the yellow one to the left. And then the penstemon is up in the front by the sidewalk. And then there's some poppies in this garden as well. So this is mostly like a purple and orange and yellow garden. And here's just some close-ups of a couple of the plants I mentioned. All of these plants are on the plant list as well. The monkey flower, which is locally native, and you can see this hiking up in our local hills. Not necessarily always looking good year-round, so I wouldn't plant it as the primary focal point. I'd plant it as the middle plant. Because when it's blooming, it looks spectacular. And when it's not blooming, it looks kind of so-so. So I let it bloom, trim it back, and then just plant other things around it. But it's a great hummingbird plant. And then the Verbena de la Mina comes from down kind of like more southern California region, kind of Mexico area. Very fragrant plant and a really, really great butterfly plant. And it does very well in our area. And then two other plants from this garden. The penstemon Margarita Bach is a small kind of bluish purple penstemon that blooms in spring. And the Monardella villosa is the Kylie mint. This one has a minty fragrance, blooms in the late spring to summer, is locally native. You can see it on local trails as well. Does very, very well in gardens and attracts a lot of butterflies and moths to it. I put this one in here because it shows some good contrast of foliage, and it also is an example of two different red flowers that bloom at different times of year. So in the middle is the California fuchsia or epilobium, and on the right side is the Gambelia speciosa, the flowering red right now, and that red flower is the Gambelia flower. So these are both red tubular flowers, they attract hummingbirds, but by putting the two together, you get interesting gray and green foliage, but then you get a longer season of hummingbird plants because you have a spring bloomer and a summer bloomer for hummingbirds. And then of course the beautiful stone wall, it doesn't hurt either because it has some nice structure. Adds some nice aesthetics. This is a garden I designed many years ago with lots of different grasses and also the epilobium or California fuchsia for summer bloom. The tall grass is a deer grass, the one on the right there. And this is its summer look. And this one also, I'll show a picture later of some other different texture happening there. But you can see there's only two things blooming, but the garden is interesting because it has a lot of texture and focal points and unique foliage. I'm going to talk next about grasslands and meadows. These are for full sun and some for part shade. They usually are perennial bunch grasses, so the grasses that come from one clump. They can have annual or perennial flowers in them, sometimes even some native California bulbs. And they typically do not require frequent mowing, so you're not usually trying to make a lawn, you're trying to make more of a natural meadow. And they can tolerate some minimal foot traffic, just kind of like walking through them, not game playing. This one is called Carex panza or dune sedge, in two different settings here. It's a great kind of a low to medium high. It's a grass-like plant because it's actually a sedge, not a tree grass, but stays green most of the year, creeps gently by small rhizomes, and makes a really nice meadow. So if you want a green space, but you don't want to mow it and take care of it like you would a lawn, this is a great substitute. Here's another green substitute called Festuca occidentalis. And here we have the Verbena lilacina combined with it. So it makes it really showy, but it's a really simple design, but really lower maintenance than lawn. And then Festuca californica is locally native and can tolerate a little bit of shade. It's a little bit taller, so it's more like a 2 to 3 foot grass, and it puts up plumes that are about maybe 3 foot tall, kind of have a nice russet tone to them. Can be really nice under an oak tree or on a hillside with part shade. And then a strikingly gray grass. This one's actually a hybrid. It's called Festuca Siskiyou Blue, so it's a hybrid between native and non-native fescue grasses. They're very showy. You can see it here. That's its bloom. And the deer grass, I showed you a picture of that a little bit before, but here's two different images of that. The one on the left is more of like its fall look after it's kind of completely bloomed. It looks really good against a dark background because it's kind of a bright, sort of like a buff color. And then the one on the right is its spring look. It's kind of lush and green in the spring. And this one, you typically would prune it back right around this time of year, not too much in the winter because it's winter dormant. It's not going to grow in the winter. So you want to prune it right before it's going to grow because it's a warm season grass. So you can actually leave it like that one in the upper left where it's just full and showy. You could stay like that all winter long. And then the blue grama grass, this one is really interesting because it comes up and it kind of has a little side, almost looks like an eyelash. And it's about 2.5 feet high and attracts some really interesting little butterflies and moths. And it just has a very showy kind of unique look, especially if planted in a grouping. A lot of grasses look good either planted as one single specimen like deer grass or planted in kind of a swath. And then this is not a grass plant, but I put it in here anyway because it's a lawn substitute plant. So it can be used as kind of a meadow plant. It's our white yarrow, which is locally native as well as native to lots of different other places. Has a white flower, ferny foliage. You can actually mow it, walk on it. Probably not going to be able to play too much soccer on it or active games, but you can definitely walk around on it and sit chairs on it and things like that. The woodland garden is for warm summers, no summer rainfall, part shade and often sloped, and often has some clay soils. So I'm going to talk about woodland garden, and then I'm going to show some example landscapes, and then we'll wrap it up and take questions. So woodland gardens, these are just two kind of examples to show you the aesthetic. They often have a mature tree or an oak tree, and things can often have a little bit of shade. The toyon is one of our woodland garden plants. In fact, this one can stay as a shrub or even be pruned up into a tall tree, like about 20 feet or so as it grows older. It makes a white flower during the summer and then very bright red berries in the winter. So it's a great festive plant for winter. It attracts birds and it's an evergreen plant and locally native. The Oregon grape, this one also comes in kind of a somewhat tall variety, a medium, and then a short ground cover variety. Great plant for birds, evergreen, makes a yellow flower and a little blueberry. The berry is edible as well for people. And you can see its foliage, it gets a little bit of that burgundy tint to it. So it just has really interesting foliage to it. It's got tiny prickles on the edge of the foliage, so it can be kind of a nice edge plant too. If you wouldn't plant it where you want to brush by it, you plant it where you don't want to brush by it. But it's also good cover for birds. And the Ribes sanguineum and also Malvaceum, these are late winter bloomers and often white or very deep pink colors. Really good for hummingbirds as well, and just really showy focal points. They have a beautiful branch structure, and then the flowers hang down. They're just really attractive. These kinds of plants can be really great on the north side of your house or the east side of your house where you don't have full hot sun and you need a plant that can take a little bit of shade. Coffeeberry as well is another really easy care evergreen shrub that's actually surprisingly a really good habitat plant. It doesn't look like it. It doesn't have a huge bloom, but it really offers a lot. It's very easy to care for because it doesn't need a lot of pruning. It just looks good all year round and attracts birds, caterpillars, butterflies, bats, all sorts of things. It does have the berry. I wouldn't eat this one. It can tend to make you get a little indigestion, but the birds like it. And Ceanothus Yankee Point, now this one's a little bit of a cheat in this category because it's actually more of a coastal plant, but I put it in the woodland category because I wanted to talk about at least some of the Ceanothus, because this one can tolerate part shade. So you can see it here growing underneath a tree and it's getting some dappled sunlight, and this is what it would love because inland here, we don't have those coastal, foggy, cool days, we can put a little bit of shade, which will give a coastal plant a better chance to grow. This one can get to be about 6 or 8 feet wide. It blooms in the spring and attracts lots of different types of bees and butterflies, and is evergreen and really easy care as well. Bush anemone or carpentaria is a kind of our substitute for the camellia because it has a big white showy flower and also attracts lots of bees and beneficials. And it's one of the few native plants that grows narrow and upright. I would say the mahonia I talked about, this one, and the ribes. But this one you can keep in a planter that's 2 feet wide, and I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. The Iris Douglassiana, our Pacific Coast iris, they bloom for about a month in the spring, and they're very showy and nice small plants for small scale gardening. And then I also like the evergreen currant. This one it doesn't have a showy flower, but it has a wonderfully fragrant foliage. And you can train it up as a kind of a vine or a espalier on a fence. So it could be very practical where you have a part shade area and you want to train something up, right? And it can also grow as kind of a mounding ground cover. And then this is one of our manzanitas that is a ground cover manzanita, Arctostaphylos uva-ursi. There are lots of varieties of ground cover manzanita that all grow low to medium. This is just one of them. Evergreen and super easy to care for, don't need a lot of pruning, and don't grow too aggressively. They do flower, but typically not as profusely as the shrubs, trees. And then this is another good evergreen for screening. It's called the Pacific Wax Myrtle, Myrica californica. I think it's now Morella californica. Stays evergreen, makes a berry for birds as well. In our heucheras, our alum roots, the one on the left is Heuchera maxima, and these are great hummingbird plants, fairly low, get to be about 2 to 2.5 feet in bloom. And then here's the narrow bed I was talking about, where we have put the Carpentaria californica, some iris, and some heuchera in a bed that's about 2 feet wide and kept it narrow like that. Okay, so I'm going to go through some example landscapes pretty quickly because we have to get out fairly quickly, but I want to make sure you can see them. This will also be recorded so you can look at them in more detail later. This is an English style chaparral garden. So we have some Shasta, sulfur, buckwheat, and some Baccharis, Twin Peaks, some repetition, some interesting hardscape, and it's kind of simple and low. This is a chaparral garden where we combine the blue curls or the Trichostima lacuna, the Eriogonum crocatum, and a manzanita, and there's some different color textures with the flowers, some gray, some green, and some different shapes of foliage for interest there. Here's a summer look with Eriogonum arborescens, which is the island buckwheat. And then that big tree in the middle is a desert willow, which blooms during the summer and has gorgeous blooms. And this tree has been lovingly pruned by the Unitarian Church up in Palo Alto. They did an amazing job with this tree. Here's another chaparral in summer with some red California fuchsia. The yellow is the Eriophyllum confertiflorum, which is a local native. It's actually called the golden yarrow, even though it's not related to yarrow, but it's a wonderful plant. You can see hiking in the hills locally here. And then the blue curls is the blue plant there in the middle. And then Spanish style, we have kind of a Mediterranean or Spanish look here with this garden with some different ceanothus and some different salvias. So we have California lilac or ceanothus, and that provides the green, and then the salvia is providing the gray. And everything here is kind of in the blues and purples. So it's a very simple garden, blues, purples, greens, and grays. And this is what it looks like in the summer. There's actually a little bit of red California fuchsia there kind of popping out. And then you can see the plants as they kind of change color and throughout the season there. This is what I would call a chaparral natural style. The home is a little bit contemporary, but the garden is pretty natural. It doesn't have any specific linearity to it, just lots of interesting plants and colors and textures. with ceanothus and manzanita and more salvias, and a couple deergrass. And this garden I showed because there's no flowers here other than the fescue flowers, but you can see it's pretty interesting because there's texture and color contrast just with the foliage. So trying to think through that idea versus just flowers. This is a modern look with native plants where we've borrowed this mature manzanita that was already existing there, and then we've added some small perennials with some different colors and textures and kind of made it, honor the modern architecture, but still kind of a natural look. And this one is a modern meadow style. It has a very functional walkway. It's got some seating area in the front, a warm color scheme, and lots of different textures and contrasts. But the whole thing is kind of low, like a meadow, with blooming things in it. And here's this close-up of one of the areas of that same garden where you can see some greens and grays and different flower colors. And this is on the other side of that same garden. We did a meandering pathway of decomposed granite so they could get around and maintain and also just enjoy the garden. And a little tiny area to play some ball catch with the owner and his son. And this is the summer look of the plant on the side there with kind of the brownish is the Verbena lilacina after it finished blooming. So they'll probably cut that back at some point soon, this picture. And another one with just some interesting textures, kind of a modern look with different layers of grasses and another warm color scheme with different textures and contrast. A couple more slides. This one is a woodland style garden. And so it's a woodland and a meadow combined. The back behind the table is the wax myrtle. And then in the foreground is the heuchera on the left and a meadow with fescues and some wildflowers. And then the natural stone was created there to create a little sitting area, but just kind of a very natural sitting area. And this is another view of the same garden. The big tree is a valley oak tree. And then you can see more toward the meadow. And they actually blended a tiny, tiny area of mowed grass with a little bit of meadow. Same garden, mowed grass, a little bit of the meadow, and a small sitting area in the back. And those plants are pretty young in the back. They actually grew to be very tall, covered the fence and covered the views. And then this is another woodland style garden with coffee berries up in the planter and native strawberries or fragaria down in the front. And then just a really casual little sitting area with some iris. That behind this fence are big tall redwood trees. That's what shades this garden. And last picture, this is another woodland style with some ground cover strawberry on the left, a coffee berry on the right, the big evergreen there. And they reused some concrete pieces that they had chopped up from a path to create some step stones and a little wall there. Okay, and I think these have already been mentioned, but I put the Growing Natives Garden Tour link on there, which is coming up very soon in April, free tour. Great way to get ideas from lots of different designers, homeowners, do-it-yourself. Really recommend that. You can go on the website if you sign up and then see example pictures of the gardens beforehand, which is worth it as well. And then the rebates we didn't talk a lot about, but removing your lawn and putting in low water and California native plants makes you eligible for a rebate through valleywater.org. So check that out if you're interested. It's a really good deal. And then the resources handout, if you didn't get it, is here. So please feel free to grab one of those. And I will turn it over to questions since I know we have about 10, 15 more minutes. Thank you for letting me get through all the pictures. There's only one, so let her speak. Oh, you can maybe repeat it. Yeah, question.
So we've got two big dogs.
Okay,
So
I'll
any
repeat.
plants that are in a resource for us to find out what's poisonous and where they can run around.
Okay, big dogs question. What is poisonous? So I usually look up online toxic to dogs, and usually Google will come back with information, and then the is it ASPCA? I'm not sure if I got that right, but it's Association of Animals